It is past midnight in Constantinople, and a man is being sewn into a leather sack. He has done nothing but sit in a warm room and drink a cup of something dark and bitter, and for that, he is about to be dropped into the black water of the Bosphorus to drown. The soldiers work quickly, because the Sultan himself is watching from the shadows, disguised as a commoner, and the Sultan has decided that the smell of roasted beans in his city is the smell of treason. His name is lost. He is a shopkeeper or a soldier, or a tired father who wanted 1 hour of quiet before another hard day. All we know is that he chose the wrong cup on the wrong night in the reign of a ruler who believed that a room full of men drinking coffee was a room full of men plotting his death. And the terrible thing, the thing you have to understand before we go any further, is that in his own strange way, the Sultan was right. Coffee has toppled more rulers than most armies. It has funded slavery, financed empires, and lit the fuse under revolutions. And it is sitting on your kitchen counter right now. But the story of coffee does not begin in that dark room on the water. It begins thousands of years earlier and thousands of miles to the south, in the cool green highlands of Ethiopia, in a place called Kaffa, where the plant grew wild before anyone thought to be afraid of it. To understand why an emperor would drown a man over a drink, you have to go back to a time when nobody drank it at all. Because here is the first thing almost no one knows. For most of its history, coffee was not a drink. Legend says it was discovered by a goat herd named Kaldi, who noticed his animals dancing on their back legs, refusing to sleep after eating the bright red cherries of a certain shrub. It is a lovely story, and it is almost certainly a myth invented centuries later. What is real is stranger. The people of the Ethiopian highlands did not brew coffee. They ate it. They crushed the beans, mixed them with animal fat, and rolled them into dense little balls that warriors and travelers carried into the mountains. A single fistful of these could keep a man marching and fighting through a day with no food and no rest. They had no word for caffeine. They had no idea there was a chemical inside that cherry rewiring the human brain. But they were harnessing it anyway, generation after generation, long before any European had heard the plant existed. That is their story. It belongs to them, and no empire that came later can take it. Think about that for a second. Every latte, every espresso, every gas station cup you have ever grabbed on the way to work descends from a wild bush on an African hillside, and a people who figured out its secret with nothing but observation and patience. A small green seed. A whole planet reorganized around staying awake. That contrast is the entire story, and it only gets sharper from here. The leap from food to drink happened across the water, in Yemen, and it happened inside mosques. Sometime around the 15th century, Sufi mystics discovered that a hot infusion made from roasted coffee beans could hold off sleep. And for men who needed to chant and pray through the long hours of the night, that was close to a miracle. They roasted the beans, ground them, and steeped them in water, and they called the result kahwa. From the port city of Mocha, whose name you still drink today whether you know it or not, coffee spread across the Islamic world. And almost the instant it became popular, the trouble started. Because coffee did something no drink had done before. It created a new kind of place. Not a tavern where men grew drunk and stupid, but a coffee house, where men grew alert and talkative and dangerously clever. They argued, they gossiped, they discussed the price of grain and the failures of the powerful. And to the men who held power, a room full of sharp, sober, wide-awake citizens was far more frightening than a room full of drunks. So they came for it. In the year 1511, in the holy city of Mecca, a governor named Khair Beg looked at the crowds gathering to drink this dark liquid and decided it was a threat. He assembled jurists and doctors and demanded a ruling. Was coffee an intoxicant, forbidden like wine? The debate that followed was deadly serious and, from where we sit today, quietly hilarious. Learned men argued over whether the warmth in your chest after a cup was the same sinful warmth as alcohol. Coffee was banned, beans were burned in the streets, and it did not work because it never works. Within a few years, the ban collapsed, reportedly because the Sultan in Cairo loved his morning cup and overruled everyone. The people who tried to kill coffee kept discovering the same inconvenient fact. Their own officials were addicted to it. When coffee finally reached Christian Europe, The same panic arrived with it. Here was a black, bitter drink from the Muslim world, and to some clergymen that made it nothing less than the beverage of the devil, a trick to lure good Christians away from wine, which was, after all, the blood of Christ. The pressure reportedly climbed all the way to the Vatican and to Pope Clement VIII, who was asked to condemn the drink and settle the matter forever. According to the story that has been told for centuries, the Pope asked to taste this satanic brew before he banned it. He took a sip. He paused. And he is said to have declared that a drink this delicious could not possibly belong to Satan, and that they ought to baptize it and make it Christian. Whether he truly said those words, no one can prove. But the drink was never banned in Europe, and the panic curdled into obsession within a single generation. And that is the pattern you need to hold in your mind, because it repeats in country after country. First they fear it, then they try to kill it, then they cannot live without it. The clock was already ticking on every ruler who thought he could stop it. They just could not hear it yet. Which brings us back to that man in the sack, and to the Ottoman Sultan watching him die. His name was Murad IV, and he did not merely disapprove of coffee, he hunted it. He shut the coffeehouses of Constantinople because he was convinced, not without reason, that they were nests of sedition, where soldiers and citizens whispered against his throne. He made drinking coffee a capital crime, and the chronicles tell us he did not delegate the enforcement. He walked his own city at night in disguise, a giant of a man with a heavy sword, and when he caught someone with the forbidden drink, he sometimes carried out the sentence with his own hands. A first offense might cost you a beating. A second could cost you your life, sewn into a sack and given to the sea. He ruled a quarter of the known world, and he spent his nights personally executing his own subjects over a hot beverage. That is how much power the powerful believed was hiding inside that little bean. But no ban could hold, and no border could contain it, because coffee had a weakness that turned out to be its greatest strength. It grew from a seed, and a seed can be hidden. For a long time, the Arab world guarded its monopoly with ferocity. Coffee could leave the port of Mocha only after the beans had been parched or boiled, killed, made infertile, so that no one could plant a rival crop. A fortune rested on a rule that simple: do not let a living bean escape. And here is where our story finds its first unlikely hero, a man who broke the greatest agricultural monopoly on earth with nothing but faith and a bandage. His name, by tradition, was Baba Budan, an Indian Sufi pilgrim who traveled to Mecca and, on his way home, stopped in the port of Mocha and tasted the drink the whole world was fighting over. He decided the secret was too precious to leave in one nation's hands, and so the story goes, he took 7 green coffee beans, still alive, still able to grow, and he strapped them to his belly beneath his robes, and he smuggled them out past the guards and across the sea to the hills of southern India. 7 beans, taped to the stomach of a single traveling monk, ended a monopoly that had made an empire rich. Those hills still carry his name today. Sit with that for a moment. The entire coffee industry of India, worth billions, began as a smuggling operation hidden under a holy man's shirt. Once the living bean was loose, it could not be caught again. The Dutch stole seedlings and grew them in their greenhouses in their colonies in Java, which is why, to this day, an American will ask for a cup of Java without ever knowing he is naming a distant island. And then comes the man who, more than any other, deserves to stand in the front rank of coffee's obsessives, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu. Around the year 1720, de Clieu got his hands on a single coffee seedling, a descendant of a plant the King of France kept locked and guarded in a royal greenhouse in Paris like a jewel. De Clieu was convinced this plant could make the French colony of Martinique rich, and he was determined to carry it across the Atlantic himself. What happened on that voyage has been retold so many times that it has passed into legend, but the core of it appears in his own account. The ship was becalmed, water ran short, rations were cut to a trickle, barely enough to keep a man alive, and de Clieu, dying of thirst on a windless sea, shared his own tiny water ration with the plant. Cup by cup, day after day, a man drank half of what he needed so that a seedling in a pot could live. He fought off a jealous passenger who tried to tear it from his hands. He shielded it from salt spray. And when he finally staggered ashore in Martinique, that one plant survived. From that single seedling, guarded by a half-mad officer sipping seawater rations, descended nearly all the coffee of the Caribbean and much of the coffee of Latin America. A man dividing his last water with a plant became the origin of billions of cups. Hold that image, because it is beautiful, and because we are about to watch that beauty turn into something monstrous. Because the moment coffee became something you could grow by the shipload, it stopped being a drink and became a machine for making money. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the tropics, there was only one way anyone knew to run a machine that huge. Human beings owned, bought, and worked until they died. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The most valuable colony on the face of the earth in the 18th century was a small French island called Saint-Domingue, the western third of an island we now call Haiti. It produced sugar, and it produced coffee, and by the 1780s it was growing a staggering share of all the coffee in the world. It did this on the broken backs of 500,000 enslaved Africans, worked in conditions so lethal that the plantations had to import fresh human beings by the tens of thousands every single year, because the ones already there were dying faster than they could have children. This is not a footnote to the story of coffee. This is the story of coffee. I want you to stop picturing the emperors and the popes and the naval officers for a moment, and picture one person instead, a woman, no name recorded anywhere, working a coffee slope in the tropical heat. Her hands move down the branches, picking the red cherries one by one, because coffee will not all ripen at once, and a machine cannot tell ripe from unripe. So it must be human fingers, always human fingers. Her back does not straighten. The overseer watches. The beans she is picking will be dried and shipped across an ocean and sold in an elegant coffeehouse in Paris or London, where a gentleman in a clean coat will stir sugar, also cut by the enslaved, into a cup and complain that the service is slow. She will never see that cup. She will most likely be dead within a few years of arriving, and the ships will bring more people to take her place. This is the part that should make you angry, and I need you to let it. We tell the history of coffee as a charming tale of goat herds and monks and clever smugglers, and all of that is true, but it sits on top of a foundation of suffering so vast that the numbers stop meaning anything. Millions of Africans were carried across the Atlantic in chains, and a huge share of them were spent, that is the word the accountants used, spent on the plantations that fed Europe's new hunger for sugar and coffee. In Brazil, which became the coffee giant of the world in the 19th century, the enslaved population climbed into the millions, and the coffee barons grew so rich they built opera houses in the jungle. The wealth was real. It funded palaces and railways and banks whose names you would recognize, and every ounce of it was extracted from people whose names no one bothered to write down. The plant was not evil. The bean did no wrong. The blight of slavery was a human choice, made by men in clean rooms with account books, who decided that other human beings were a line item. Nature grew the coffee, men built the horror. And when that horror was finally challenged, it took another kind of blood to end it. In 1791, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue rose up in the only successful large-scale slave revolt in modern history, burned the coffee and sugar plantations to the ground, and after more than a decade of brutal war, founded the free nation of Haiti. The richest colony on earth chose to destroy itself rather than remain a machine for the dead. The world punished them for it for the next 2 centuries, but they did it. That is their story too, and it belongs to them. You might think the darkness ends with abolition. It does not. It just changes its clothes. Fast forward to the 20th century, to the small nation of El Salvador, where a handful of families, sometimes called the 14, owned nearly all the good coffee land and nearly all the wealth that came with it. In 1932, coffee prices had collapsed in the global depression. Wages had been slashed, and the indigenous peasants who worked the coffee slopes were starving. They rose up, and the man who answered them was the country's dictator, General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, a strange, mystical figure who believed in reincarnation and telepathy, and once tried to cure a smallpox epidemic by stringing colored lights across the capital. What Martinez did to the coffee country is remembered by a single word: La Matanza, the slaughter. The army and the coffee-backed authorities swept through the western highlands and killed, By the most common estimate, tens of thousands of peasants, most of them indigenous, many of them murdered simply for looking indigenous, for wearing traditional dress. 30,000 human beings by many counts. 30,000! And the man who ordered it is remembered for a chilling line, reportedly spoken as a justification, that it is a greater crime to kill an ant than a man, because when a man dies, he is reincarnated, while an ant dies forever. He wrote and spoke as a head of state, in the open, not in some private diary. The falling coffee price was the market, cold and blind. The massacre was a decision. A man made it, and signed his name to the country that made it possible. Coffee did not pull those triggers. But the wealth locked up in those green slopes and the desperate poverty of the people forced to work them built the pressure that exploded. Again and again, across 4 centuries and 3 continents, the same pattern. A small bean, an enormous pile of money, and a mountain of bodies underneath it that we have mostly agreed not to look at. So look, just for a moment. Then let me show you the other thing coffee did, the thing that is almost impossible to believe when you set it beside the graves. Because that same drink, the one soaked in all that blood, is also one of the greatest engines of human ideas ever invented. Go back to the coffeehouses, the ones that so terrified Murad IV, and it turns out, terrified the English crown just as much. When coffee reached London in the 1600s, coffeehouses exploded across the city, and they earned a nickname that tells you everything. Penny universities. For the price of a single penny, the cost of a cup, any man could walk in and sit among merchants and scientists and poets and philosophers and simply listen, or argue, or learn. Isaac Newton's circle argued physics in them. Sailors and traders swapped news of distant ships, and out of that hum of caffeinated conversation, real institutions were born. A coffeehouse run by a man named Edward Lloyd became the gathering place for men who insured ships, and it grew over the centuries into Lloyd's of London, one of the largest insurance markets on the planet. Another London coffeehouse called Jonathan's is where stockbrokers who had been thrown out of the Royal Exchange for rowdiness set up shop, and it became, in time, the London Stock Exchange. Modern finance, the thing that moves trillions of dollars a day around the world, was quite literally born on the sticky tables of rooms that smelled of roasted beans. The whole apparatus of global capitalism has caffeine in its blood. The English crown noticed and panicked, exactly like Murad had. In 1675, King Charles II issued a proclamation to shut the coffeehouses down, calling them places where idle and disaffected people spread false and scandalous reports against the government. He was terrified of what men said over coffee. And here is the delicious part. The ban was so wildly unpopular that it was withdrawn in about 11 days. The King of England blinked. Coffee won. The clock had run out on him, just as it had on every ruler before him who thought a beverage could be outlawed. And then coffee did the thing the Sultan was most afraid of. It helped light a revolution. On the 12th of July, 1789, in the gardens of the Palais Royal in Paris, a young lawyer named Camille Desmoulins leaped onto a table outside the Café de Foix, a pistol in his hand, and called the crowd to arms against the king. 2 days later, the mob stormed the Bastille, and the French Revolution had begun. It did not start in a palace. It started outside a coffeehouse, in the electric, wired, wide-awake atmosphere that only that drink creates. The Sultan, who drowned men in sacks, understood something that historians sometimes miss. Coffee does not just wake up the body. It wakes up the crowd. Now let me hit you with the things that are simply strange. The facts you will find yourself repeating to someone before the end of the day. Coffee is so genetically fragile that a single fungus once nearly wiped it off the map. In the 1870s, a disease called coffee leaf rust swept through the island of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, which at the time was one of the greatest coffee producers on earth. Within a couple of decades, the rust destroyed the industry almost completely. The planters, desperate, ripped out their dying coffee and replaced it with a different crop. And that is the only reason that Sri Lanka, and much of the world it supplied, drinks tea today instead of coffee. A microscopic orange fungus rewrote the drinking habits of hundreds of millions of people. The empire did not choose tea over coffee out of taste. A mold made the choice for it. Here's another. The most expensive coffee in the world is made from beans that have been eaten by a small cat-like animal called a civet, passed through its digestive system, and collected from its droppings. It is called kopi luwak, and people pay extraordinary sums per cup for the privilege of drinking coffee that has, to put it plainly, already been through an animal once. The luxury market for a beverage born in the poverty of colonized slopes now sells feces at the price of fine wine. And coffee has left the planet. In 2015, an Italian-built espresso machine was carried up to the International Space Station so that astronauts orbiting the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour could drink a proper cup. They called it the Espresso. The same drink that a goatherd's goat supposedly discovered on an Ethiopian hillside is now brewed in zero gravity, above the atmosphere, circling the world 16 times a day. And the scale of the modern habit is almost hard to hold in your head. In the United States alone, people drink hundreds of millions of cups of coffee every single day. Roughly 2 out of every 3 American adults reach for it. It is not a treat anymore. It is the fuel the entire working world runs on. The first thing millions of people touch each morning before they touch anything else. A global ritual performed by billions of hands from Addis Ababa to Seattle, all of it flowing back to one wild shrub on one African hillside. So think about that for a second. Really sit inside it. The next time you stand in your kitchen in the gray light of early morning, half awake, waiting for the machine to finish, holding an ordinary cup of an ordinary drink, remember what is actually in your hands. You are holding the reason monks could pray through the night, and the reason a governor burned beans in the streets of Mecca. You are holding the drink a pope is said to have blessed, and a sultan drowned men to stop. You are holding 7 seeds taped to a smuggler's belly, and a seedling given the last of a dying sailor's water. You are holding the fortune that funded slave ships and the poverty that soaked the ground of El Salvador. You are holding Lloyd's of London and the storming of the Bastille. You are holding a cup that has been to space. And somewhere, back at the beginning of all of it, is a man in a leather sack, sinking into the black water of the Bosphorus in the dark, because he wanted one quiet cup of the same drink you are about to pour without a second thought. He never knew his cup would outlive every empire that tried to ban it. He never knew that 400 years later, billions of people would do freely, every morning, the very thing that killed him. You will never look at a cup of coffee the same way again. Now, I want to hear from you. So drop a comment and tell me which one landed hardest. Was it La Matanza, the 30,000 killed in the coffee highlands over a collapsing price? Was it the dictator's aunt? Or was it the strangest turn of all, the fact that we now pay a fortune to drink coffee pulled from the droppings of a jungle cat, and that we have carried espresso into orbit? Tell me which one you will be repeating to the next person who hands you a cup. And if this changed the way you see the ordinary thing in your hand, stay with us, because the next everyday object hides a story just as dark, and we are going to pour it out for you next.